Australia's Labour Prime Minister, John Curtin.
I'm happy to be back in Australia. I've seen many things and many places. And although every man can be forgiven for loving his own country best, I believe it is an impartial assessment of the facts to say that I have not seen any country or any people better than my own.
Welcome to Curtin's Cast, the John Curtin Research Centre's podcast, brought to you by myself, Nick Dyrenforth, and Redbridge's Cos Samaras. Each week, we bring you the freshest and most challenging conversations from the world of Australian and global politics, culture and ideas. Good morning, Curtinistas. Welcome back. It's a beautiful sunny Monday. I'm Nick Dyrenforth, Executive Director of the John Curtin Research Centre. I'm joined by my mate, Simon Welsh, Samurai Simon, filling in again for Cosmos Kung Fu Samaras. We've got a fantastic guest today on the show, Gautam Raju. Gautam is a campaign strategist with over 14 years' experience leading advocacy efforts across Europe, Kenya, India, and the US of A on issues including men's health, youth policy, democracy and digital rights. He currently leads global men's health policy and advocacy at Movember, working to influence systems and shift public attitudes towards the most pressing issues facing men and boys. He's got a very impressive CV, and I could spend the next half an hour leading you through his CV. Welcome, Gautam.
Thanks for having me on, boys.
Welcome back, Simon.
Thanks, Nick. Good to be back, mate.
Gautam, as I said, you've got an impressive CV. Now, in a leadership position with Movember, we were just chatting off air about your family's sort of fascinating backstory.
Yep.
And your dad arrived during under the reign of a Labor icon, a Labor guru,
Yep.
Gough Whitlam.
Yes, he did. He came under Gough's when Gough was in power, and he came under his Fijian Indian, and he came under the free education policy, so he got to study in Australia for free. He'll always be a Labor man till he dies, and it was drummed into me as a small kid. You got to vote Labor. They got us here. And he still votes Labor to this day. And now my mum also votes Labor. So big Labor family.
You don't need to tell us who you vote for. I'll take a wild guess.
Yeah. So it was drummed in the values, the social justice values. And also, I think for migrants when they move to a new country, under that government that brought them in, it's something that they feel really connected to. And Dad always tells the story about Gough and free education and how that was, transformative not only for him but for our entire family, because he ended up bringing his entire family over, and we all live here now and call Australia home.
Amazing. And you were saying before we started that it was such big news. It even made the newspaper at the time.
Yes, it did make the local newspaper when Dad moved over, saying there is a new pharmacy student who's come over from Fiji, which was quite fascinating. When you think about the diverse country that we are now, thinking that would pick up like local coverage, and now we're in a new world where it's completely changed the demographics of Australia. I remember growing up, going to high school in Melbourne, me and my brother being one of the only brown kids in high school, and now that's completely changed, hasn't it?
And how'd you find that?
Interesting. I've got I feel like growing up here, I have a bit of a conflicted, I love this country. I'm really passionate about it. I really believe that we have a chance to make Australia the best place in the world to be. We can be the most progressive country in the world. But I did, growing up in Australia, there was, quite a bit of racism that we faced. I think those dynamics have changed, and moving back to Australia after living and working in politics for over 15 years, I guess coming back here with two young kids, I feel optimistic about where we're at, and the opportunities and potentially the things that they don't have to face that I faced.
You led the UN Secretary General's global campaign to combat COVID-19 misinformation.
Yeah.
And you're able to reach 1 billion people globally. Big job.
Yes.
Misinformation, disinformation was rampant.
Yeah. That was an incredible opportunity to do and a huge privilege. I learned a lot, and that was at the sort of the conversation about misinformation and disinformation didn't really hit mainstream narrative till during COVID, I think, like when it really started to pick up and people really started to understand the impacts, particularly from a health perspective. And what we were finding was, the UN had hundreds of offers of people coming to them being like, how can we help? How can we support? And we basically set up a campaigning infrastructure to respond to that influx of support. There were things like Facebook were giving them unlimited ad credits to run the right information on getting share graphics and videos out there to broadcasters being like, what's the right information to kind of push out? So we set up this infrastructure that would respond to that moment. And the thing around COVID was like getting out first was the most important thing to do, and being able to dispel misinformation as quickly as it came up was kind of the other thing. So we were scanning for misinformation and then kind of combating it and trying to counter it as quickly as we could. I think we created something like 25,000 pieces of assets during that 2-year program to kind of combat misinformation. We learned lots.
Sorry, just on that. So when you sort of look at Australia's political information ecosystem, as they like to call it, what do you see when you look at from that experience? I mean, are there potential weaknesses, vulnerabilities, flaws there, or are we pretty robust?
Great question. I think it feels quite concentrated, doesn't it? Like it doesn't feel like there's tons of different distribution points, media distribution points. I think initiatives like this are starting to pop up, but in terms of like if you want to get strong coverage here, you're still going to the traditional broadcasters, where in other countries like the UK or the US or Europe, it's definitely kind of completely changed there, where podcasters and influencers are holding a lot of the kind of power, whereas I think that shift hasn't happened here so much, but I think it's in the way of happening. There are like amazing channels like the Daily Oz that are obviously incredibly influential, starting to pick up momentum, but I still think that maybe as a society we're not there yet in terms of the shift, and it's just not. I think, it's such a small country like us with only, 24 million people. I think to have like such a, diverse media market becomes kind of unsustainable because there's not enough money here to support that. But I guess it's shifting and changing.
You've held sort of what a stellar career. You founded ourside.org. You've worked at Oxfam. Been involved with Teach for Australia. You're a scholar. You're a visiting fellow at University of Melbourne and a visiting fellow at Oxford. Why Movember? It seems to make sense, I think, because when we talk about that misinformation during the COVID period, I think a lot was directed at young men.
Yeah,
and online.
Yeah. It's a good question, one that I thought a lot about, and I guess there are a couple of reasons why. The main reason why is because I went through a pretty serious men's health issue during the COVID period, and I realised that the experience that I got from the health system was horrific. And I started to dig down and talk to friends and family and other people in my circles, and I realised that was something that wasn't unique to me. And I felt like there was something that needed to change there. And if I was getting this experience, imagine what people that didn't have the resources or the education, like the access to education, or came from a family that was medical, how they would sort of navigate themselves through a really complex health issue. And that's one of the main reasons I was motivated to apply for the role. And I guess one of my big concerns when applying for the role from Movember is, because I've come from progressive circles, progressive campaigning my entire life, was how it would be perceived to be working on an issue like men's health.
Yeah.
Would people be like, have you become a men's rights activist? Which, to this day, I still have to counter that narrative.
That's part of the problem, though, isn't it?
Yeah. And it was really uncomfortable for me for about a year to be able to tell the story in a way that would be like, no, this is important because these reasons, because, So, and I feel like since when I joined 2.5 years ago, the conversation around men and boys has moved on so much, where there's a mainstream conversation now about masculinity influences, about young men becoming more and more conservative, what that means for political outcomes, the impact of poor men's health on families and women and children, domestic violence. All of that stuff has become the mainstream conversation, but it wasn't when I joined. And but I still think progressives have a long way to go to actually understand how to actually reach and engage and bring men in as part of the conversation.
It's probably worth just pausing for a moment, just talking about sort of the state of men's health in this country, and then sort of maybe, the factors, the drivers behind, sort of what we're seeing in those sort of outcomes.
Yeah. We know that most men are dying too young, and they're mostly dying from preventable diseases. And we released a report last year that highlighted that. And there's a few driving factors of why that's happening. It's because men don't seek help when they need help. We know that men engage in more risky-taking behaviours. We think some of the masculine norms that men adhere to are really problematic in seeking help as well, and going out for, when you need to see a doctor, when you have a symptom, what's stopping them from doing that? And these are some of the issues. We also know that the health system isn't responsive to the needs of men. So when they do show up, in many cases, they don't get a good experience, so they don't come back. And so we need to upskill the workforce to be able to respond to the needs of men. And so we think there are some real tangible things that can be put into place to do that, and that's what we're advocating for in Australia and abroad.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? Because there's a fair bit of talk around medical misogyny, and rightly so. But the health system seems not to be working equally for men. Like it's not just medical misogyny; it's a system that doesn't work for anyone. Kind of thing. And Nick, we did a bit of research with Movember and Gautam, and certainly that was a theme that came through, wasn't it? This idea that if I'm going to be able to provide for my family, getting caught up in a health system that's going to sort of keep me out of work or keep me away from those responsibilities is a real factor for a lot of men, and deciding whether or not to seek out help.
Absolutely, and that medical and misogyny is obviously a really big problem, right, within the system. Like, you hear that everywhere, and it's not that we're trying to say that it isn't. We're just trying to say that it's also men do feel a level of bias when they do enter the system, and that needs to be addressed in a similar way to the issues that women face or trans people face, etc., when they engage with the health system. And we know that there are really ways that really tangible ways you can improve that through upskilling the workforce to be able to understand how to treat men when they do access to the health system, how men actually talk about stuff, how do you get men to open up? How do you break through some of these masculine norms? How do you build strong connection in the room? So when that, so they come back, so they feel like there's trust there.
As you said, you come from a progressive background.
Yeah.
Obviously, I come from a progressive background, centre-left background, Labor guy, union guy. A lot of us have grave fears that progressives, have ignored or downplayed. I'm just sort of searching for the right word here. Some of the legitimate sort of health concerns of men, concerns around status, identity. What do you think are the risks involved in particularly the progressive side of politics being seen to ignore these concerns? But equally, how do we engage with these concerns and young men in particular, without sort of regressing back to the 1950s and reinforcing the regressive norms of that era?
Yeah. Movember doesn't have a political view. Like, they're focused on improving men's health. Yeah. I'm taking my Movember hat and putting my Gautam Raju hat on, campaigner. I'd say that, we're seeing some of the impacts of some of these shifts playing out right now. We saw it play out in with the Trump election, where we saw young men moving for Trump in ways that we've never seen before. We're seeing those dynamics now play out in the UK, looking at what's driving some of the shifts away from Labor to Reform. Like, I don't know if you guys have seen the latest polling, but there's like 300 seats that they're looking at picking up if there was an election that was run today. We see those trends playing out. We see young men becoming more conservatives. We see young women becoming more progressive. In Australia, that's kind of hasn't really happened in the way in terms of electoral impact. We haven't seen that play out, and I think that's because we have compulsory voting, right? And so that's the barrier, right? That's the barrier that's stopping. But I think the ideology and the influence and the narrative is still pushing men away, and we hear that from our research. And so men are looking, and young men and boys, they're looking for, if you look at the research and you ask them, the things they're looking for is how to become a better man.
Yeah.
They're confused about their role in society. The number one thing that they're Googling right now is like, how do I become a better man? How do I date a girl? How do I ask a girl out? It's really quite basic and quite sad, right? Like they're
No, I don't mean to laugh, but it's like
because
growing up, this is just we didn't Google it.
but everything's changed, right? And so the role of a man and boy has changed, right? And they don't know how to show up and they're confused. And what they are told is they're told they're toxic and they're told they're problematic. And that alienates them and moves them down to dark actors, right? And so as we think of being a progressive movement, we have to be open and we have to be able to say to men and boys, we know that you're hurting and we know you're confused. Why don't you come in and join us and we can hear you. We hear you when we see you. What Trump and the Republicans did was they made men feel heard. And that's how they mobilized them. They had no policies. There were no policies there for men. It was just like, we see you and we hear you. And some of the work that we're doing in the UK with the UK government is about hearing men and putting the policies forward that that will improve men's health outcomes. Movember. In Australia, we had the government here actually make one of the biggest commitments ever to men's health ever, as a result of the great research that we did, because there was some concern saying that if we invest in men's health, are we going to alienate the women's vote? And it was actually the biggest supporters of investment in men's health is actually women, because they're sick of looking after men in their lives. and when it's not a zero-sum game. Investing in women's health shouldn't be at the cost of not investing in men's health, and vice versa.
And I think that's the perception which has developed, though, hasn't it, Gautam? We've talked about the Trumpian appeal to young men, and progressives have sort of bandied around terms like toxic masculinity. I understand what people are trying to express, but I think that term, toxic masculinity, it's like, if you're trying to appeal to men's better angels, it's the worst possible term. You're basically saying all men are bad. Yeah.
When I talk to my mates who are blue-collar workers from, proud union supporters, always been part of the union movement, particularly in Victoria, and I say to them, will you vote for Labor this coming election? They say to me, no, because for the first time ever, I'm not going to vote Labor because I feel like they've forgotten who I am. And they're not representing my concerns. We just kept being told that we're doing the wrong thing, And so the government needs to find ways to actually connect with its roots. Like, this is where the progressive movement came from. Like, blue collar workers, people are becoming more. The focus groups that we ran together, men are sitting there saying, "How do you expect me to go to the doctor when cheese is $12?" Like, I can't afford to pay the difference between them. There's no bulk billing. Rah, rah. So I think we need to get back to kind of the basics of this stuff, of where people are at, and meet men where they are, which is, they're confused, they're worried about the economic uncertainty of the times, and they're confused about their role and where to show up.
That's part of what the progressive side has done here. As you say, we're using these terms like toxic masculinity, but we're using them in isolation. We're not giving people an alternative. What's the alternative to toxic masculinity? What does that look like? And it might be just interesting to talk about some of the stuff that Movember's doing, because some people might just be thinking of Movember as the people that do the prostate cancer stuff. So it might be a bit interesting to talk about some of those broader things that you guys are doing.
Yeah, in the last few years, we've taken a bit of a strategic shift to focus on all of men's health and looking at all of men's health. And so we've doubled down on, we've launched something called the Movember Institute of Men's Health, where we're doubling down on building research, on understanding what's actually happening when it comes to men's health, why are men dying young, what are those leading causes, and how do we intervene early? And we're looking at it more from a prevention end, right? So before you get to the hospital, what are all the things that can be put in place? We look at life stages as well, so meeting men where they're at. When you go to uni or you go to TAFE or you go to college for the first time, that's an intervention point to start talking to men and bring men into the health system, to talk to them about sexual health. When you become a dad for the first time, that's a really big missed opportunity to bring men into the health system, because what we do know is men only really show up in the health system in crisis point. So when they've chopped their arm off or they've at that pointy end of mental health care where, they need to be admitted.
And sometimes not even they chop their arm off. There was a bloke in the groups that we did for Gautam that talked about he'd cut his hand on I think it was a bench saw, wasn't it? And knew that he went to hospital, that'd probably see him off work for a week, which he couldn't afford. So he went to his next door neighbour who happened to be a nurse to ask her whether or not he should go to hospital with half his hand hanging off. So sometimes even chopping your arm off's not enough.
And what we know is that if we can build muscle and like that kind of engagement muscle with the health system early on, you can get men into the health system sooner. And so before we know there are, when you have that relationship breakdown or you go through a divorce, you're not, we know that's kind of a driver in suicide. So, particularly middle-aged men. So you can have those support systems around you to help you through that. So you have the tools to be able to navigate the system, right? And so that's what we're thinking about Movember, is that kind of life stage approach that meets men where they're at in the moments that they are in life, and then advocating for some of those changes to happen as well.
There does seem to be a sea change in attitudes and in the public consciousness. I think we're starting to see sort of green shoots of being able to talk about these issues quite openly, and men, I think, are beginning to feel like that they can actually talk about these issues. What are some of the sort of roadblocks which you think exist? I've just talked about some of, I think, the unhelpful rhetoric, which emanates particularly from the progressive side of politics. And it's not to dismiss the fact that, many of the right-wing arguments and this sort of MAGA movement and Trumpism, they're driving a lot of these trends. But where do you see the debate at now?
Yeah, I think, there's that thing of like men should open up. Are you okay? All of these sort of things, right? Encouraging men to, if they, to talk about how they're feeling, because we know the suicide rates are 3 times higher in men. The roadblocks that we have is the stuff that I've been speaking about, which is when men do show up to the health system, they do get a good experience. And they have that great experience, so they come back. We talk about it in terms of the 3 Rs: reach, respond, and retain men in healthcare. And so we're doing lots of work on the reach, but when they show up, do they retain? And how do we respond to them to keep them in the health system? And I think that's where the opportunity is for us. Because I think there's a lot of momentum around the reach. When what we know from our research is when men do sort of speak up and say they need help, they regret it. There's a large majority of them that regret it. And that means that society, the health system, isn't actually connected or in tune to what men need and where they're at.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things, I wrote an article for the New Daily a few months ago. There was obviously a tragic duo of suicides within the Selwood family, former AFL footballers. And I actually thought it'd be a great idea to have a dedicated mental health round, which I think would complement the work that Movember does, because, as you said, suicide is the leading cause of death for men and women aged 15 to 24. Yeah. Over 1 in 5 people aged 25 to 44. That's the AFL's, it's the core market.
Yeah.
It's the core market.
Yeah. There's lots of calls for that to happen,
And it's not just... I don't want to make this too depressing, but it's not just suicides. It's those deaths of despair. In which men are massively overrepresented. So whether it's deaths from overdoses, intentional sort of car accidents on country roads and those sorts of things. So it's something that we really need to be talking about.
Yeah, it's kind of like we've made space for the conversation, but we haven't put the other parts of the puzzle in place. And that's what we're advocating for, and that's what we're pushing for. The interesting story, when it comes to young dads, we know that young dads, it's kind of one of the biggest moments in a man's life when you become a father for the first time, right? You've got kids, it's an absolute shit show, right?
Yeah,
right.
There's no training manual. I got 3 kids, and when the first turned up, it's just like, what's going on here?
So it's like absolute, but there's no formal structure, sort of support for dads, right? There's nothing. So we started pushing, the government to say, hey, why don't we screen for mental health in dads? So when you become a dad for the first time, you get a mental health screen.
It's a great idea.
And the response was, if we screen, we won't be able to meet the demand. That's
really?
That's the response, and that's an issue that we're going to be tackling. But it's quite a well acknowledged issue that we have, and that, improving the mental health of dads is not only good for dad, but it's good for the baby, it's good for the partner, it's good for everyone in that situation. And so, there are things like that that we need to shift to improve health outcomes and relationships, etc.
In terms of, you mentioned before that Movember had that good win prior to the election. Maybe talk a little bit about what that win entailed and where could or should it sort of go from here.
Yeah. I think so. We had an amazing announcement from Minister Butler, a $32 million investment in preventative men's health programs. The bulk of that is going to roll out the Men in Mind program that we run, which upskills the workforce to be able to treat men, which is some of the issues that I'm talking about, which means that 65 primary care practitioners or practitioners, clinical psychologists, etc., will be trained in how to treat men when they show up to the health system. It's an academically backed and reviewed program, which is incredibly exciting for us. And that's what we talk about when we talk health system changes, right? Using the frame of masculinity on how to treat men when they show up. There's some stuff in there to support the rollout of a mental health program for boys, which is linked to AFL, which is what we're talking about. It's run through like local footy clubs. So if you're a young boy and you're struggling with your mental health, you know what signs to seek and support. It's called Head of the Game. It's a program that we run in collaboration with the AFL. There's money in there for the Australian Men's Shed Association. We know that men's sheds are, and these spaces that are created for older men are incredibly powerful in getting men to connect and to share. And they've been running off the smell of an oily rag. There's more men's shed in Australia than Macca's. That's how many men's sheds there are.
Really?
Yeah. I think, and so it's like a powerful movement that kind of floats under the radar, right? And, you go to these men's sheds and you sit there with these old blokes and they feel forgotten and lost, and feel like nobody cares about them. And it's great to have an increase in that funding. I think they're running off $6 million a year. Right,
yeah,
and now it's
Melbourne earlier.
Yeah, and now that funding's increased substantially. And then to another group called Healthy Male, which is a sort of a health literacy program that kind of gives men at all life stages advice and the right information in this kind of misinformation environment that we're increasingly high misinformation environment that we live in, which is fantastic. So that's great. We were obviously thrilled by that announcement, but there's so much more that you can do. There's a men's health strategy that's in place that took many years to write. We want to get some KPIs put against that so we can actually evaluate the success of that strategy. Comes up in 2030. We want to be able to double down on all the things that have been highlighted there. That's just going to require more resources. So it's a good first step. But now we've also got Dan Ripper-Coley as a special envoy of men's health.
Yeah, he's a ripper.
He's fantastic. And it's the first step where we can actually start having some of these conversations within Parliament, within the progressive movement to kind of push for that, push for major reform over the coming years. I think the other issue that we face is, particularly when we talk to progressive politicians, is when you talk about men's health or you talk about men, there has been a historic capture of the issue by far-right actors, right? Yeah. And that has been a problem because it alienates people from the conversation straight away. And now with people like Dan in place, with more organisations like Movember joining the advocacy table, who are independent, apolitical, and driving the conversation from just pure data perspective, and not a political ideological perspective, I think we're going to get to better outcomes more quickly.
We've been talking about men in quite sort of homogenous terms.
Yeah.
But, I think we've got, you talk about the men's sheds. So I think we've actually got we've got regional nuance and variation here. Yeah. I think data to living in the outer suburbs is probably having a different lived experience to data to living in the city.
Yeah.
Part of the problem is if we're talking in these sort of homogenous terms, we lose that sense of nuance.
Yeah. No, totally. And it's like cold men, for example, they've got their own issues that we're dealing. Indigenous First Nations men,
correct. Yep.
Worst health outcomes, suicide rates, horrific. Migrant, refugee men, those communities, the health outcomes there are even worse because those communities are have huge traditional masculine norms. When I think about the Indian, Fijian community, it's very similar. None of None of those old blokes talk about anything besides, the cricket. So just talking about my family, so.
Oh, nothing wrong with talking about cricket. No. I could talk about cricket all day.
Those, when you break it down and look at men in all their diversities, there are obviously, regional rural men who are struggling with a whole bunch of stuff, even getting the right care when they need it, etc. So, yeah, and we look at those frames as well, and we advocate for those men with the different groups. So, for example, with refugee and migrant men, we work with Welcoming Australia, which is one of the largest migrant refugee nonprofits in Australia that advocate for their rights, and work with them in those communities to push for better men's health outcomes and policies for those groups.
We kind of laugh about talking about the cricket, but out of suburban and regional, those cricket clubs, those football clubs play such an important role, both in the sort of the social connection sense for men, but also the education. I remember the first time I started to learn about nutrition was when the footy club brought a nutritionist along to talk to us about nutrition. Until then, I thought nutrition was not having that pizza before training. I suppose the question on the back end of this is probably the $1 million question for you is, we're seeing declining participation and all those sorts of things. There's a whole bunch of economic factors around it. How do we put those structures back in place for young? What should that be looking like?
I think like when we look at our work in the US, in particular, and our work in the UK, we're seeing social capital eroding, right? Like it's just decline of social capital is part of the reason why you're probably seeing radicalization play out there, right? Like the disconnection from, not that I'm not advocating for religion here, but like the decline in membership of the church, the decline in membership of community groups, unions, etc. All of that is driven to this. There's where do you show up for who's mentoring you, who's giving you that advice, where's your community, right? And we see what harm that does. One of the most alarming stats that we see across, and we see this across the 20 countries that we work in, is that by the time a man turns 40, he's got one friend left in his social circle. And that just goes to show you that social isolation is becoming a huge, huge issue. And we know that social isolation leads to bad health outcomes. We also know that it leads to radicalization, particularly if they're spending more and more time online in an information ecosystem that is built by, serving you content that is outrage, because it keeps you addicted, gives you that dopamine effect, right? So these are the things that we're really concerned about, and some of the areas that we're actually funding work in is how do we bring men together in these spaces like men's sheds? How do you, for young boys, how do you show up in esports? Because we know that's where they are. So how do you go to the places and spaces where men are, meet them where they're at, and build connection and build mental health programs that bring them into the health system, or bring them in to at least understand when they need to seek help.
Do you want to talk specifically about the online sort of radicalisation and the I think the toxic influence of some social media? It's interesting, I've got a 14-year-old boy, and I worry about, he spends a lot of time online. I had to delete his TikTok account. He could have added to Kung Fu Cos Samaras' cult status there on TikTok, but I worry because and the algorithms, you watch one thing on TikTok and then the algorithm is automatically set. And some of the stuff I saw was just, I was like, wow. And YouTube as well. I watched one Joe Rogan podcast episode, and then all of a sudden, my feed was flooded with angry men, often expressing highly problematic sentiments as regards, gender roles, misogyny, and even stuff around race. That actually keeps me up at night. Is the influence of the algorithm. In the same breath, I think that men like me are now, I'm actually able to have conversations with my son, which I didn't have with my father. It's not my father's problem. It was just we didn't have these conversations about what it is to be, a good man, setting a sort of positive role model. Yeah,
it's unprecedented, right? Like this moment that we're living in. And, with the political shifts and the social shifts, like all of this stuff is like uncharted territory, right? I think in Australia, we're leading the way with the social media ban. I think many parents feel relieved by that coming in as being like something, at least some kind of tool that they can use to, put in place a mechanism they can put in place. When it comes to young men in particular, from our research and the work that we've been doing, it's the stuff that I spoke about earlier. Young boys, and we know that this content now is the mainstream. So 75% of boys between 16 to 25 are actively watching masculinity influences. We know that, right? 4,000 sample size across the UK, US, and Australia. So to think that this stuff is like niche is the wrong way to think about it. This is the mainstream, right? To understand why they're moving towards these actors is because they go in looking for advice. They're looking for, why do I feel this way? How do I date a girl? How do I get fit? How do I get ripped so I can date a girl? This is stuff they're looking for. And how and how do I seek help, right? And so they go in looking for this content. How do I be a better man, a better boy? How do I show up in society? They're Googling this stuff and they spend 6 hours at night watching hundreds and hundreds of videos and they end up in these dark spaces. And the response to that isn't to say that you're toxic because you're watching this content, but to enter the conversation with curiosity and to enter the conversation with openness to bring them back from those spaces, and it takes time. And I feel like, when I talk about this stuff publicly, I will always have a mum come up to me who's a feminist, who's and she's like, what have I done wrong? Like, why is my boy watching this content? How do I stop this? And it's nothing that the mum's done wrong or anything's done wrong. It's like a complete shift in the way that society has changed. And we don't really have the policy infrastructure to support the response to that right now because it's changing so quickly. There's no transparency around the algorithm of how it works, how it changes, how it feeds this content, the addiction of these of this content. And so what we can do is create kind of a whole of society response, which includes the schools, which includes parents, which includes friends, to kind of respond to this kind of moment that we're in around this stuff. One that enters the conversation with openness and a willingness to engage and meet boys where they're at, to understand why and build a counter kind of narrative around that. I think the other thing to say is that we don't have, if you think about some of these actors, they have incredible comms infrastructure in place. They're creating hundreds and hundreds and thousands of videos every day that's kind of reaching and engaging these boys. And we don't have that kind of infrastructure to counter that. The government can't run that. They don't know how to do it. So how do you build and resource an infrastructure to be able to respond to kind of this awful kind of information environment that's out there?
It seems to me like if you're a politician out there, and even if we take the cynical view, if you're a politician out there that's worried about the political volatility that comes from all of this, and how you approach and reach out to young men, it seems to me that health and mental health is kind of the space that enables you to be able to do that. Yeah,
it's the space that allows you to show care and empathy and understanding. It's a powerful place because we all have those issues, right? Particularly when you're young and you're trying to figure out who I am, right? And so, using that as an avenue and an entry point in can be a powerful way to bring people in. But the first thing that needs to happen is to have that curiosity, right? I'm on my kindergarten WhatsApp group, which is like all the kids in my kindergarten. And one of the mums sent through a video which was like, how to ensure that your 3-year-old boy doesn't become toxic. And I'm like, that's the problem, right? Like, that's the problem. We can't assume that they are toxic, right? And I didn't say anything, but I thought, fuck, this is where we're at, right? Like, this is, we've gone so far the other way that we don't want to alienate them.
That's well intended.
It's well intended.
It's well intended.
Yeah. But nothing works better with teenage. Oh, I know you're not talking about when they get to teenage. We're telling them, don't do this. Nothing works better.
Yeah. Now, last question, Gautam, because we're running out of. We are just about out of time. I want to know. At the Movember office, growing in the moustache contest, that it must be like out of control.
Well, if you don't grow a mo during Movember, you get fined.
Really?
by the Mo Police, and you have to make a donation to someone else's Mo page, Movember page. So it's a big deal. It's obviously our month.
Yeah.
It's our month where we grow mows, or actually we have tons of women who participate, not in growing a mow, but in like doing
In solidarity.
runs. In solidarity and runs, and a lot of them who have lost men in their lives participate as well. So it's a really powerful month of where we really connect with we've got 2 million supporters in Australia who we connect with, and we run a whole bunch of things. You'll see things all over the news and people doing crazy things to raise money for men's health. And we have just such an incredible community. And that's the reason why we're getting so much political traction as well, is because our community is incredibly powerful and they show up. They come to every meeting in Canberra with us.
Fantastic. Gautam, it's been a real pleasure having you on, talking about a really important conversation and ongoing conversation that we're going to have in Australia and globally. So thank you for taking the time to speak to us. All strength to Movember and the cause that you're backing in.
Thanks, mate. Thanks for having me on.
Our pleasure. Simon, thank you very much. I think you've now done your shift in... Actually, maybe we could punt Cos from his role co-hosting Curtin's cast. But that's it. Curtinistas, it's ciao and arrivederci.